This lesson covers organizational units, which are a critical building block of Active Directory. Every single object within Active Directory has its own access control list, which are made up of access control entries just like a file system. This controls which other users, which other objects, have which rights over this object. So for example, I can see domain admins can do anything to this user. Domain admins can also it. So if I look at the security here, once again I can see my domain admins group has full control. Account operators have a group of special permissions. So organizational units aren't actually something that contain other objects. Whereas groups is something you create that you have members of, users aren't actually placed into a group structure. A user can be a member of many different groups. Whereas organizational units is actually part of the structure. A user can only be within a single organizational unit. Now, it is possible to nest organizational units. I can actually create a new organizational unit within another organizational unit. So maybe I might have Active. So there's an organizational unit now called Active within there. So where this could be useful is I could actually place different objects within this organizational unit, but they would still inherit certain characteristics of the parent structure. Now the reason we use organizational units rather than just standard containers, which can also contain objects, is there are really two things I can do with an organizational unit. One of them is delegation of authority. So imagine the scenario, we want to try and minimize the number of domains we have. In the past NT4 days, we would maybe have to create separate domains just to give different groups of people administration over the objects contained in the domain. With Active Directory, we just create separate organizational units. So I may have an organizational unit for my London office, for my Mexico office. I may have different organizational units for domain controllers, for line of business servers A. And that enables me to now give different groups of users different levels of control over that organizational unit and the objects contained within that organizational unit. So for example, I'm going to say Batcave users. Now I could say individual users, but the same thing applies to file systems. I really don't want to start setting delegation on individual users. Create a group such as London admins, Mexico admins, sales admins, line of business server admins, add users into that group and then delegate permissions to that group. Because if I do it to users, if a user leaves or I have to add a new user, it's changing delegation every time. If I use a group, I just change the membership of that group. I can then say, what do I want to delegate? So I might say, well, you can reset passwords, you can force a change, you can modify memberships of groups within here. I can manage group policy links. I can create delete accounts. And I can create custom. I can do far more complicated lists of tasks to manage. But for now, I'm just going to stick with the basic ones. Now the members of the groups that I specified will now be given permission to this organizational unit and all the contained objects. The other place organizational units are very useful is for group policy application. If I look at my group policy management, I create group policy objects, which are collections of settings of policies. I can apply those to a site, a domain, or an organizational unit. So again, the reason we may create organizational units is not just delegation of authority. It may be I wish to have a separate set of group policy objects applied to the objects within that OU. So for example, by default, domain controllers have its own organizational units and are automatically placed within there. The reason is there is a special default domain controllers group policy object which sets some different security, some different permissions on domain controllers. This means anytime you want to be able to delegate authority, anytime you wish to be able to set different group policy, you want to create an organizational unit to contain the objects that need to be affected. It's important to note you cannot use organizational units for security on resources. For example, I can't grant a file access only to people within a certain organizational unit. I still have to use groups for security or dynamic access control. This concludes the lesson on organizational units.